Hello, hello, this is the Seasonal Rat, the one and only, and I am here today to give you my analysis, an early analysis, of what I think of the Shardsworn Alliance. In Goodneck, however you pronounce it, that is not my strong suit, but I will call it whatever for this video. There is a good, I would go into lore, but I feel like Tim already has that covered over on the Chaotic Right YouTube channel, so I will link that down below for you to look at beforehand if you're interested in any of that. Anyways, so when talking about Shardsworn, it is really important to highlight on their archetypes and common themes. They emphasize heavy tribal themes, minor emphasis on soldiers, some on brutes, but the main focus is, of course, hunters. Um, Everything circles back to hunters in the long run. They also have a small bounce sub-theme, and they have a discard and destroy archetype. They general tips and well, not just tips, but general features of Shardsworn. They are very good at disguise and tech, especially in I believe in a competitive scene. They'll be very tricky to determine and make good guesswork against. Um, they have really good disruption removal, which I think will always keep them within a very playable state to deal with any problems in a meta. Um, and the dual pace that they can play at allows them to play both very fast and very slow, depending on how you want to engineer a deck. I will note before going into this, my star ratings aren't just complete tier lists. I have them on a level of how I think they might stack up in a given meta. I don't think everything is right. It's very early, but I have five stars would be a meta or a high tier card, which I think is extremely viable. Whether if it's in the best list or one of the best lists and sees a lot of play, I think those will be cards like that. 4 is very good. I think these cards will see a lot of play. I don't think they'll be nearly as good or oppressive as the 5-star cards, but they will be in a very good spot. 3 are decent cards. I think you'll see them some. They won't be extremely common, but you'll definitely won't be surprised if you see them in decks. 2 is niche. I don't think these cards see a lot of strong suit in play in, or their strength levels are that great, but they might find small homes. And 1, I will give the rat stamp of disappointment because the rat will be disappointed in those cards. Anyways, for the core, let's start with the core set. I will go over the fighter list. First, for tier 1 heroes, we have Demolition Experts, Elven Druid, Elven Ranger, and the Orc Berserker. For tier 2s, we have Greater Cockatrice, Master of the Hunt, Ogre Shaman, and Reckless Chimera. And for tier 3s, we have the Elven Valkyrie and the Shard Dragon. For tactics, we have Ambush, Arcane Blast, Burnout, Ceasefire, Diversion, Shockwave, Snare, Toss, Trailblaze, and Unmarked Trails. Okay, let's start with the tier 1 core heroes. So for Demolition Experts, this is a card that slots into a lot of combo and mid-range lists as well, will also be attributed to being capable of running in slow decks as well. General thing with this card is it is pretty much just global, not global, but it is very consistent tier 2 removal. It removes when it dies, and it removes when it gets launched across the board with synergy cards like Toss. Or you can even, like, more niche plays, like you go Trailblaze, move to delay the explosion if you wanted. Pull it up later. But yeah, valid in multiple playstyles. You can play some Spirit of the Alliance lists, in which you stack this thing on top of another unit across the board if you have proper synergy. Shared Knowledge is another card that I'm not sure where the full state of it is currently. I think it will get better as we get more support for factions and heroes across the game. If there is an action economy that supports a card like that in Shardsworn, I think this could definitely see a lot of play because it's just cheap, another removal, like another barrage almost, with more situational effects and game by game data. Similar to Spirit of the Alliance, Come to Aid is another thing you can deploy this on top of across the board. Shard Beast is interesting with this card also. It's very similar vein to just Shared Knowledge, but I think it's albeit way more consistent. Although Shard Beast does bleed into the weakness of it can also mess up on-board state by accident, just like experts can, which is one of the reasons why this card isn't super safe, I think, in certain matchups, because some factions have really easy ways to just blow this up and you're sad, especially if you position this awkwardly, which is very common, or at least somewhat common if you find yourself behind on board. And then I have Elven Druid. I think this card is very good. It is probably going to be most prominently run in Shard Dragon list because you can just tap it and then shoot it across the board, and kill a tier 3 with it. It's pretty good at stall. It can serve itself as a pseudo extra tier 3 and help conserve actions in like a niche use case when you might not want to move a unit up or deploy another unit or something like that. You can just snare an enemy close to gates. Like I just said, it buys times for tactics, and it can actually pivot to potential win cons in decks like Ogre or Dragon, in which you make stacks, you blow things up, you burn out, and then you can fly this thing into gates, especially if you have like Shard Wisp to remove things off the board. It is definitely an option, especially in the slower decks that don't stack up to the moon, but you can still get decks that stack up to like 2, 3 high if you play your cards right. Why do you not run this? It attributes down to tempo cost, just like Shared Knowledge in its problem. Albeit, I think this is way more consistent and way more viable in a multitude of deck lists. It is expensive to bear form every turn, which you want to avoid doing, but sometimes it's the best option you can get. It very matchup dependent, very unreactive, which is another weakness of it. So it has to fit into those specific deck lists that can actually afford it to take those actions. Then you won't die from just not playing your tempo game. Now, this might be one of my most controversial ratings. I don't think Elven Ranger is extremely good. I know it shuts down, my bad. Important cards like Weavers from Auroxi or Faithful Servants or Standard Bearers, which are all extremely strong tempo cards, or late game value cards in the case of some of the Weavers, like the attachment one. But I think that payoff is almost kind of restricted for Shardsworn, whereas a lot of their other tier 1s can definitely deal with tier 2s and sometimes even tier 3s in some cases and really help pivot their decks to their main win conditions. This card almost just slows down the opponent in a way and doesn't completely take what they're trying to do away. Or at least it can't. Which is why I think it's limited in nature to their other tier 1 options, which a lot of the synergy cards I have are literally just stall because I don't think this card really contributes enough to deck lists a lot of the time. Maybe if there's metas where tier 1s are really important to take out and they're like priority targets, this card gets run. But apart from like maybe Valkyrie, maybe some Ogre lists, I don't really see this card being super prevalent. Orc Berserker. I am a fan of this card being I am a spirit player. It definitely does deter the opponent from committing like too far into your line or back row. Can trade into tier 3s, which you're completely fine with. You'll take that any day. You can do sneaky plays with this card, like Inspiration. If you already have a Hunter on board with like Master of the Hunt, Inspiration it. This then turns into an Exploding Bomb you can move across the board. Same thing with Shared Knowledge, which is, again, the action cost is a little steep, but if you can get it to work, it's pretty good. You can stack it on top of this thing and really trick your opponent with Diversion by moving like a tier 1 on top of it up, and then Diversion the thin to the bottom of your deck, and you attack with this. Experienced players will probably notice that, but that is things you can do, because it also means they can't really push anyways, because you could always double trade to stack or 3. Come to 8 is obviously one of the reasons this card was designed, or they were probably designed together. They work very well together, of course. Cockatrice was probably one of the easiest enablers with this card, because if they are in mid or something, you play Cockatrice, you have this card, you can slap it because it can't move. It gets fatigued. And then my favorite use case, Spirit of the Alliance. It's super strong. It is a hefty action cost with some of the tactics, well, not action costs, but it does cost a few tactics in your deck that you have to commit to it. But you can throw this in across the board on top of chimeras and stuff like that, which really can turn it into like more of a defensive card that pushes people back into an offensive tool, because chimera can come down, blow up all the ones, and then you put this in on top of it if you have a spirit, and now they have to commit at least tier 2s because they don't have anything reactionary, most likely. But yeah, that does bleed into the idea of why you wouldn't run it, because some setups require several synergy cards lined up, like Inspiration, etc. If positioned poorly, it is just a tier 1 with no text, which is a problem in some matchups that can afford just to throw garbage at you and are fine trading it. Like, I bet Gloamin can make this card difficult to use, but it also is matchup dependent. But I think this card is just going to be very good in general. Now on to the tier 2 core heroes. Greater Cockatrice. Why? Well, I think you run this card for punishing and stalling people. It has kind of a dual use case. I think the stalling is definitely the weaker side of it, and the punishing is what you want to do. Obviously, with Orc Berserker as highlighted previously, you can stun things to set your ogre off into them by either trading ogre or just making them like almost commit to board more because you play Cockatrice and you put a surprise ogre next turn. They have to commit they wanted to commit to take a push. Elven Trapper definitely has a lot of success from this card. You can fatigue thins and get your traps to actually work so they won't move back, which is helpful. You can do Cockatrice if you see brutes or tier 3 brutes. That is a great time to do ambush tier 3 hunter. Move your then just get a clean trade. You move up. They're at a huge tempo loss now, and they lost to tier 3 for basically nothing. And then Wrangler is definitely something I don't think is very good, but there's a possibility if you can really just make nasty trait trades on your opponent throughout the game by recycling Cockatrice deploy effects. But yeah, it's just generally good to trade even after you fatigue something, make that positive trade with that because Shardsworn just likes good tempo a lot of the time with this card. This card can get weakened by enemies that make stack heavy setups because if you basically Cockatrice in their back row, it can be a problem because they could just stack a tier 1 of garbage on top of it and you can't get a clean trade with someone, which is something you have to realize and makes this card most strong when opponents are in mid row, especially with tier 3 units that you can clean trade into. Yeah, overall it kind of needs some space and some prior board setup, but it can definitely make some it's a really easy gateway into finding out how to scam trade people. I think it will see some play, but I don't think it will be the most prevalent in these metas. Master the Hunt. In my opinion, this is one of, if not the best tier 2 in the game for hero-wise. It can snowball very hard, obviously. You can just chain hunters into attacking tier 2s, and then even trading as tier 3s. This then makes brutes extremely hard to play into Shardsworn. It's very consistent if you position it properly, especially behind, like sandwiched between 2/3s, and it's in the back corner of your back row, which can happen surprisingly often with Shard if you have proper setups. It just overall turns hunters into serious threats with things like Giant Stalker or Hunter's Mark or Valkyrie. In Spiritless, it's also interesting because you can inspiration turn things into hunters, and then your spirit can basically just treat anything it wants across the board, and you have a lot of flexibility from doing things like spirit across the board unit that's now a hunter. I ambush with it, and then I can attack Master of the Hunt with that because of the effect that unit I just summoned again. If it is still alive, if you have actions to do things like that, come to aid, stuff like that works with this card. Yeah, it really makes things like Snare and Valkyrie also work very consistently. And I think the only reasons you don't run this card are if you're running some very specific like Shard Dragon or Ogre Nihilist OTK that doesn't need to run hunters to execute or fulfill its game plan. Ogre Shaman. This is a card that is kind of weird because it might look like it gives you a ton of tempo, which it does. It can really out-tempo people, but it also gives you the chance to mess yourself up. One nice thing about this card is that you can dodge trait weaknesses in matchups, or if you really don't like this unit, you can just dump a unit from hand, kill it, you basically just traded. It's equivalent of a trade, so you don't really gain a ton apart from tempo from doing actions like that. And it also drops. It can also be favorable and unfavorable if you're losing or winning trait weaknesses. If not shooting important units, like I stated in the cons of this card, you should be push aggression to get something out of your overload actions. So looking for sieges if you want to be aggressive with this card, because I think at the end of the day, in a lot of slower matchups, if the opponent gets to keep their thins down and you're playing this thin for tempo unsmartly, you will probably lose games because they are going to outvalue you. And it does incentivize hand size, which is something to consider, especially if you ever need to take draw actions, or if you can't find the right thin, then you might just tap this thin like haphazardly instead of taking another play just because it's the best thin you have in hand, where it might end up being a losing play later on in the game. This thin with Shard Beast is interesting because it's another way to cheaply delete tier 2s by zapping a tier 1 or zapping a tier 2 from across the board with Overload. This card will definitely be a riser and shifter depending on what people play and what units need to be targeted. But yeah, I generally see this then being very mid-range-esque. It does encroach on Dragon space a little bit in a negative way for Ogre itself. Reckless Chimera. I think this card is very good and very flexible. It is really good at being aggressive while also playing passively while maintaining space and almost like baiting your opponent into taking actions that you pre-sequence multiple turns before, if you do things properly. It is just generally safe and good to play. It can be deployed across the board even if it doesn't destroy anything. It can also take out those high priority ones like Standard Bearer Servant for basically no added cost. It's already a decent unit. And yeah, it opens up space. And with this space, you can like do Spirit of Alliance or Shard Dragon across the board. I mean, like Chimera across the board. You blow up ones, you Shard Dragon. You can basically just full reset board, come to 8 on top of it. You can share knowledge this thin with other heroes, I guess, to get destroy effects. Again, that's completely attributed to how good action gain is in Shardsworn, or if they can actually afford to do things like that with stuff like Village. Inspiration is my favorite use case for this card, because you can inspire other units, like Spirit of the Alliance, give things traits, and then you can place things like Orc Berserkers, etc., on top of this, or Ambush from Hunters. So, yeah, it is definitely possibilities. Another thin Shard Beast can work with. Make sure you have predetermined position in first, which shouldn't be as much of a problem with this card as things like Experts, but yeah, and Elder is in the same vein, except for it is not as good because you don't get the immediate procs in the turn that you can play it, because it is a startup turn trigger. Why not? I guess like if you aren't really worried about any tier 1s in a matchup, you don't have to run this, but it still is a decent card no matter what, because it is a very consistent value generator, and it will space out games at times, especially if you are feeling locked on boards. Not completely locked, of course, but feeling like you need more space while still having a little bit of room to work with. But yeah, you could always slot in something more synergistic if you find it, but I think this thing will definitely see home in a lot of good decks. Already on to the tier 3 core heroes. First up, we have Elven Valkyrie. This is kind of like the poster child of the Hunter decks. This is the intro for a lot of players for Shardsworn, either this or Shard Dragon, and I think both are very viable. Why exactly is this card so good? Well, it creates a lot of scenarios regarding movement restriction for the opponent, which can be very difficult to deal with if they have predetermined things or preset things like Giant Stalker or Master of the Hunt on board, or even Blockade to mess up movement, in which you are bouncing this thing around. Well, technically not, because it doesn't move when resolving attacks, but that's almost better in some scenarios because you keep this thing back and you poke them out, and especially if you have trade advantage, it makes some factions really suffer into Shardsworn. It can be sneaky and slow at the same time. It depends on how you play it. Generally, I think a pivotal mid-range approach is best, but it's a flexible card that can be experimented with, especially with things like diversion or snare or trails, just to create space. Just very consistent value. Just compared to things like Spirit or Ogre. Why do you not run this? If opponents are really good at like breaking position in, or they have a huge trade advantage into you, that might be a weakness into Valkyrie. It is really hard to find a complete weakness in this card because it's just so solid and consistent. But matchups into the greediest decks can be potentially awkward, especially if you mess up your position in beforehand. If they can get in and make trade with this card or another pivotal unit. And then everyone's favorite dragon, the only dragon, the Shard Dragon. This guy is extremely good. Extremely versatile, valid in tempo and aggro. Assuming you have stacks on board. Can be bounced relatively easily with bounce effects, which you maybe do it like once or twice a game. It's not something you even need to do because this thing just captures tempo so well, but usually at least once. And it can even flex into endgame OTKs after you've bounced it into under certain lists, which you can do burnout combos, shard wisp combos, fly things into gates like druid, etc., etc. Another slot for Master the Hunt if you want to. Um, like this card doesn't really have many weaknesses apart from the player making the mistakes themselves. Because if you don't want to play this card if you're only seeking to neutral trade, that's a poor choice because then you're basically just using your tier 3 for the same way that you would usually make the mistake of using Ogre Shaman itself. And you want to find a way to carve an advantage with this card, which you definitely can, and it's finding the synergies in your deck. So I think this card, it's not broken by any means. It's just very, very strong, and I think it's very flexible, and I do not see this not being one of the most prominent decks you'll see in like a competitive format for the early days of Gunnak. Core tactics. So I decided to break these down in a much simpler fashion, and I believe I got them all lined up in somewhat of a synergistic archetype comp. So let's talk about the hunter tactics first, or at least the directly synergistic ones. Ambush I have at very meta. I think this is extremely cheap into brute related comps and is generally good for making trades and compressing actions. This is the type of card you run in every single hunter deck ever for Shardsworn. No excuses. Trailblaze is a more niche one. I don't think it's worth the slot in a lot of hunter lists. Maybe if you're playing super aggressive, but I think you always want to just deploy units instead most of the time. If you're playing some OTK lists, I could see this, but at the same time, that's also where things like Elven Druid come in. So if you can find another slot in, and decide to play more tempo, and then just run a basic tier 1 hunter, and then you hope you trailblaze in with a burnout combo with something like Dragon or Ogre, I could also see that. But I'm not super high in this card. Snare, I think Snare is extremely flexible. It is generally better than Cockatrices because you can do it on command, and you don't need to clog up space and back that you might not want to move or place something into later in a further date. Um, yeah, it's just really good, especially in decks like Spirit of the Alliance. Diversion 5 stars. This card is basically just another fatigue cheat. You can stack 2 units in back, a junk unit, and a really good unit under it. Move it up. Diversion. Make a clean trade, or just make a general trade for unit you want. It's extremely proficient. I think it's gonna be an auto coup in most tempo aggressive mid range hunter decks. I could also see it just being run in maybe some bounce lists. I don't know. I think it might be too slow, but it could also be ways to put just units on bottom that you don't want to lose if you ever get yourself in a bad position, which is just another use case for the card. Um, I think Toss is a decent removal spell or tactic. Um, I don't think it's bad by any means, but I do think it has a lot more conditionality and deck build, a little bit of deck building with it, which is always something you have to consider, even if it doesn't look huge. It's still a decent card, but I think the decks that you will use Toss in are not as efficient and not as like generally generally good as some other lists you could play for Shardsworn, which is something I could see Toss getting better, but as long as shared knowledge kind of stays as it is, I don't know. It depends on how much action gain once again Shard can really take advantage of. Um, I have Shockwave at tier 2 being a niche card. I don't really see why I would run this. I think it kind of kills a lot of my tempo as Shard when I could be dealing with tier 1s relatively easily, like no matter what. Burnout I think is amazing. Think of its tempo on crack. Um, it is actually cooked in Dragon and Ogre lists, and there is an argument. I don't know how good it actually is in these lists yet, but there's an argument for Spirit lists because effectively, if you do trade, which you will be attacking a lot and killing things, it is just tempo in a lot of use cases, which I'm not sure Shard completely wants, and there's probably a better slot in those lists. But it is a flexible opportunity you could try or experiment with. Arcane Blast. This is a weird one. I think it's pretty good. It probably single-handedly wins certain matchups in which you need to snipe a certain card at a certain time to pitch your junk, but it also has to find very specific lists that you are okay with pitching junk. Like probably some dragon lists, probably some ogre lists if it works out. And then we have 2 of like the stack deterrent and stuff like that. Ceasefire. I think this is just really good. For I mean, I could see it in ogre, but it has a little anti synergy if you don't time it properly at the same time. because all that aggression the opponent pushed off that you'd want an ogre to have against it is just gone. The main use case for ogre decks is it just wipes the board if they stack too much. Trails is just generally good for keeping tempo. I it's kind of just what it does. I think it's a really easy card to slot into a lot of hunter decks, especially um, when you don't really know what you need to run, but you want a solid, generally good card that almost always works. Okay, now we're on to the Rotborn expansion. Now this is the first expansion for Shardsworn, and they got traps this time around. So their fighter list is Elven Trapper at 1, Shard Wisp at 1, and then for their tier 2s they have Wyvern Swarm and Corrupted Shard Beast, and then they have Ogre Nihilist. For their tactics list, they got 5 traps this time around. It's the only faction with traps so far. And they have Basilisk Egg, Blockade, Concealed Post, Explosive Trap, and Sprint Trap. Okay, let's go into talk about the heroes first again. Elven Trapper. This is an interesting card. It creates guessing games and tempo and control matchups on what trap is what, and like generally attributed to. We will see how these traps pan out in the future, but this card will be very much linked to being viable as these traps are. Its most efficient use case is just fatigue things like Snare and Cockatrice, just to guarantee trigger a trap, especially stuff like Explosive Trap. It's really only here to maximize trap efficiency, so it's not. It's like you base an entire deck around traps and then banking on working. So if that's enough to stop certain matchups that you're aiming for, it's probably a good card. I'm not sure how all around this is going to perform into most decks around, especially ones that might push too fast or push too slow where these traps won't matter. Shard Wisp. I think this is definitely one of the most underrated cards. At least one of the most underrated tier 1 heroes that I don't really ever see anyone talking about, really. It serves as a really efficient and non-expensive combo tool, which is a prime tool for dealing with stacks covering gates, which is a cheap way that Shardsworn can secure wins, or at least late game Shardsworn. It's not that good in early tempo Shardsworn. You want this for later control decks like Ogre and Dragon. Another burnout combo piece, it could work with Wyvern, but generally not as good because you want to be unstacking and assuming they already have it in there, you need to be destroying that with Dragon or Ogre. It is pretty good because a lot of the time with these shared knowledge combos, which is also a card you could run with this potentially, they're expensive action-wise, in which you can't do all the movement and position things you would normally do with Shardsworn Tempo, or slower lists, which is fine because you're not going to be playing Tempo with Wisp. But it's like free action compression almost, which is really good for these late game decks that really need to just do the combo, get in. Can I do it? Can I not? Can the opponent deal with my stacks? But yeah, notes for being bad. It's mainly just if they're too aggressive, this card is just kind of like just delays the inevitable, and there goes an important tier 1 unit that just literally unstacks your thins 2 on the board. So it actually might be a pretty bad drawback itself. And if you're playing aggressive, this card does not really fulfill a purpose because just doesn't really do anything. Corrupted Shard Beast. Very similar vein to Toss. It's a volatile action, or unit, but it is ability to delete tier 2s over and over again, and 1s. But just like Toss and all of its synergy pieces, which are fairly similar, with the added bonuses of like Shard Dragon or Shockwave consistency plays, it also leaves yourself in potentially awkward board states in which you could actually harm your own board. And it also just needs several combo pieces, just like Toss does, to generate its value. Otherwise, it could very well just be something that the opponent can force you into making a bad decision, like haphazardly by accident. Wyvern Swarm. I'm not a huge fan of this card. I don't think it's that great. I don't think it's the worst than ever. I don't think it is. But it seems like a combo piece that just seems worse than Druid. It does have no added action cost, which is pretty nice, and it can gum up the opponent's back row to a degree. But it also has the drawbacks of being borderline useless without having access to those combo tools or those removal spells or tactics for back row. And it's not as consistent or safe compared to Shard's other combo decks, which I think these are just one of the issues I have with Wyvern is it feels very much like a weird tempo tool which isn't good enough to compare with something like Chimera, um, or even toss Shard Beast, throw in over experts. But it just seems like a lesser extent, a worse version of making Ogre or Shard Dragon decks. Nihilist. Um, this is a very interesting card. I think in a lot of matchups, it completely punishes your opponent for overcommitting. And it could just screw them over if they don't understand what you're playing or they don't catch on to it soon enough. And it can also set up those nasty OTK combos with Wisp, albeit I think it's definitely worse than Shard Dragons. Um, you can do funny things like Concealed Post and Explosive Trap to do it quickly, especially if you have already pre-stacks on the board, like a Wisp and then two different stacks. You don't have to Wisp your Druid under it. You can Wisp something else instead. Especially Wisp and things before the Ogre would kill them, because I believe you can resolve those effects in an order in which you destroy them. It does force opponents to target stacks, so you can use that to your advantage, because that's usually how Ogre performs its late game combos. And some of the issues it can have is opponents can play around Ogre as compared to the more versatile Shard Dragon in general cases. And Hunters are very common. Losing late game stack potential is a possibility. Um, both of those are pretty bad issues, especially if you are finding a lot of other Shardsworn decks on ladder and you have Ogre, you are in a bad spot probably, because it is really easy for them to almost tap their board back to hand if they're playing certain lists, or even to the bottom of their deck. And they can immediately on command kill Ogre because they have positive Hunter that trades into it. And there goes your deck. There goes your 3 condition. So I think there are definitely ways to deal with Ogre. And I think Dragon is most of the time the better option. Although there might be specific metas or niches within matchups that Ogre is in fact better. And now onto the tactics. Now, all the traps, I have these 3 traps on this page because they actually function slightly differently than the other traps. These traps will trigger at the beginning of your turn or when an enemy fighter enters the square. Obviously, Elven Trapper can trigger them in a different fashion, but ignore that for now. I think the best is Blockade. I think it fits in really well with cards like Elven Valkyrie and their use cases. Can really restrict opponent's movement, and they almost have to put brutes on that square to even move and remove this whole thing, and that makes it even harder because that's exactly what you want your hunters into. Um, Trap is a lot of the time it just blanks and misfires if you're not fatiguing things. So be sure you have things like Snare and Cockatrice, but it definitely can be a thing that wins games if your opponent misplays or they overextend and clog up their back row and they can't retreat things. I definitely think Sprint the Trap is one of the weaker traps, if not the weakest. I think its issue is it doesn't really attribute to a game plan, and I guess if they're playing against things like Ogre, maybe this works. I don't see a huge use case for this until Bounce maybe gets more support. Um, Basilisk Egg. So these two are different. Before I go on, these two are different in the fact that these only trigger at start of turn. Beginning of turn technically. But if your opponent steps on these, they get destroyed. They don't do their effect, which is extremely important. Basilisk is a really rough way for your opponent to experience shutdown. It has its weaknesses because it like sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it usually in a lot of cases it encourages even trades, which is something Shard is fine with. If you have a tempo advantage on board, this is extremely powerful. But sometimes it just isn't, and it feels like a pretty fair trap a lot of scenarios. Concealed Post on the other hand is extremely dirty trap. Although it's balanced in the sense that your opponent will like almost always move away from it, and in those scenarios, it won't actually get the full value from the card, in which they can put attack. So this card will pretty much never see its full value unless your opponent slips up and makes a pretty bad mistake, or your list is good enough at creating guessing games in which they will do so. Depends on the amount of traps you run and the quality or quantity of traps. Now, time to talk about the Auroxi expansion for the Shardsworn. Their fighter list is Goblin Elder, Half Orc. Both those are tier 1s. Their tier 2s are Expert Wrangler and Goblin Giant Stalker. And their tier 3 is Spirit of the Alliance. And their tactics list are Sentry Blades, Come to Aid, Hunter's Mark, Inspiration, and Share Knowledge. Important to note, attachments were added in the Auroxi expansion, and Shardsworn's 2 attachments to this expansion are Sentry Blades and Hunter's Mark. Let's talk about the expansion heroes. First up, we have Goblin Elder. This is a unit that you want in typical lists that are tribal. Most notably, I like running this in Spirit of the Alliance because it lets me staple and do combos like ambushing across the board or snaring other units. With combo tools like Inspiration. Chimera is a really niche use case with this then, but if it doesn't die and it survives the turn that you deploy it into a back row, an enemy back row, you can start a turn it, and now you can deploy things like Mash, the Hunt, etc., on top of it. You can also just do immediate combos if you already have Spirit of the Alliance on the board. You can go Chimera, Berserker, but that's not even necessarily with Elder. These are just other ways that you can do combos with them. Elder does have the niche use case of being able to staple Sentry Blades onto other minions, other units, which is interesting. But yeah, like I said, it can create wide boards with stuff like Spirit or Chimera under Spirit use cases. Why not? Well, this card requires a lot of heavy amounts of scheme. Why did I say scheme? I meant tactic. Unmatch is getting to my brain. Then match rod is real. Requires heavy amounts of scheme and dex energy. Yeah, so you do have to commit several tactics a lot of time to get full use out of this card, because it literally has no impact when not sequencing, and it will just be kind of a dead card there. It just doesn't really generally do much. Half Orc. I really wanted to try this card when I first saw it, and I've experimented some with it. I am not a fan at all. I think it is easy to apply board presence via multiple traits with this card, and the dual option of its archetypes are interesting to say the least. But I just think this then has some anti-synergy problems almost with Spirit, because that's obviously what you want to run this in. I don't think running a gimmicky fighter like this is necessarily worth it when all you do is just stall for time almost in how it works, because you don't care about the tier 1 and Spirit decks. You don't need to pull that up, and you don't need to protect the stack, because what you want to do is you want to create trades and leverage with Spirit with stuff like Ambush and Berserker. So I just doesn't attribute to winning games generally, I don't think. And it just clashes with the general curve of a deck I think is already potentially good if you know how to play aggro on the right hands, and just it tries to warp a archetype from an aggressive to more of a mid-range style, which I don't think it works out in its favor. I think this card could definitely end up actually seeing very little play, if any at all, potentially. Next is Expert Wrangler, another card I'm not super high on. Its purpose is obviously to reuse deploy effects. It can create unpredictable board states rather quickly, with stuff like Chimera or Dragon, Giant Stalker, which is a weird case because you might be able to loop the Giant Stalker things, but how much is that actually worth? You could be running Master. Same case for Half Orc. Why are you doing that together? Cockatrice is a maybe in trap decks, but I bet there's other options you might want to consider running. Also, but that is one of the more interesting possibilities I think I have decided. Although you could just do Chimera trap decks, play it, block a back row, they can't move, your traps are guaranteed to go off, depending on how high value those traps actually are. Come to Aid and Diversion are interesting with this card because I believe they don't destroy the fighter, because it would be Wrangler would be underneath the fighter you deployed. So that is a way to get board presence or just move around. Common. Oh yeah. Well, Diversion would put it on the bottom of the deck, but yeah. Well, yeah. It just sits in hand oftentimes, and middle and payout. It's just generally not impressive. I think this card could see play, but it's going to depend a lot on what other people run as well and what actually the meta wants to see. Next up is Goblin Giant Stalker. Now, this is a card I am not 100% certain on, but I do think it is extremely good. It might not be a high tier or a meta card, but it is definitely up there, depending on what Master of the Hunt wants as an accomplice piece. Now, stat bonuses in this game are really good. We see it in Lord High, cards like that. Giant Stalker is similar. You don't get too greedy with this card. You just need like one positive trade, go over a 3, kill a 3, or a couple 2s. This card has already got its value because you've maintained so much tempo with it already, especially with Master. Snare, um, Inspiration, Shared Knowledge, all those things are interesting. Shared Knowledge especially is interesting with this card because you can staple on the effects of Leap to other units. And Sentry Blades is also unique in the fact that you can put this on a Leap target and it can leap with it. Now, that also depends, once again, on how the action economy of Shardsworn is to support combos like that. And if it's sufficient or you'd rather play for a more mid-range consistent tempo then, we will have to see. This also creates new choke points in cards like Elven Valkyrie, which is pretty strong. Yeah, you probably don't run this card if Hunters aren't the build around goal, or if Master Hunt does find better duo pieces to connect compared to this card. And then we have Spirit Alliance. Personally, my favorite tier 3 in the faction, one of my favorite in the game. I've played this card a lot. I think this card is woefully underrated. I thought it was pretty poor at first compared to some of Shardsworn's other options, but now I have decided I think it might be really good. This card is extremely good at Snowball and Hard if you understand how to play its deck list properly. It can develop clean trades with stuff like Ambush into Brutes in certain matchups from across the board, in which you can deploy it onto things you create as Hunters, which your opponent might not even suspect if they don't understand matchups. You can snare other targets. Just generally really good at maintaining board presence and snowballing if you understand how to build boards and you don't get behind too quickly. And it's also a siege machine in which if you even get something in the gates, you can keep stacking over and over and over again on it. And this card doesn't even need the action economy to do such a thing because if it maintains tempo, it just keeps going and keeps cleaving through lines. It does have the general weakness of the tribal Shardsworn decks, in which it does have a heavy tactic tax for combos, in which a lot of your turns you might be playing 2 tactics, or some tactics don't even seem that good, but only really good when you piece them together, which could be potentially awkward, but I think it's well worth it in the matchups that you do need to establish tempo early. This card's really strong with Diversion, especially with being able to staple tribes, and you have like Master the Hunt down, you move within, attack, or whatever, if you have extra action, or just non-units, like you can hide a Berserker under it in the same list. So even if you don't have the synergy to place a Berserker across the board, you can stack a tier 1 soldier or tier 2 soldier on top of the Berserker. Another turn, move the Berserker up, or no, the tier 1 or tier 2 soldier on top of the Berserker, and then you diversion that tier 1 or 2 soldier, and then the Berserker can go up and it can swing, which it makes, and it's pretty flexible, which is generally other combos with this deck, but it's just all has synergy with Spirit, which is something that is pretty neat. And that cycles back, of course, to the Chimera combos and the Elder combos. But yeah, losing tempo too early can make it hard to recover and maximize pressure, which can happen in certain matchups, but I think if in general use cases that won't happen, this deck does probably get out-greeded by the greediest decks, but I think this will find at least it will find a small player base in given tourneys. And now finally, for the final segment of this video, we have the Auroxi Expansion tactics. Now, let's start with the normal tactics first. Inspiration. It's not a ton on its own. It might look pretty unremarkable. But I think this card is extremely powerful for tempo plays, and it adds Disgust and Master the Hunt combos, especially with things like Spirit Alliance, or even without Spirit Alliance or Master the Hunt. They can go either way. I think it's just very strong in those tempo lists and mid-range lists. Come to Aid is just a really solid card. Put down threatening units. Put down units across the board. They're a hunter, can strike. There's a lot of potential with this card. It might not find a home in every deck, which is completely expected, but I do think it is a solid use case card that people should definitely consider to a degree. And then Shared Knowledge. I don't know about this one yet. I think I will have to see how much action gain this faction can really endure, or wants to run. But as of now, it might be a little too awkward, but I'm gonna have to see where this card actually ends up. But shared knowledge definitely has potential in the future, especially with future faction or expansion releases, into playing how matchups will play out and how good passive heroes are gonna continue to be for this faction with stuff like toss builds. And then for the last two cards, Sentry Blades and Hunter's Mark. I think both these cards have potential. Sentry Blades is weird. Again, it's extremely powerful, but I don't actually know how what's the word? I don't actually know once again how this increased action gain with stuff like Halflin or Village is gonna work in Shard. I think they're already so good in doing what they already do with mid range and tempo and even long game that it might just be too much just to try to slot this card in just for funsies. You'll see. I don't think it's completely awful though. Hunter's Mark is another card that I think if you don't even need to run in a lot of deck lists, it's really strong. But it also has those really awkward board states where it just doesn't work some games, and you just pitch it away for no good, especially if you play it too early, too greedily. And a lot of the time, Giant Stalker will just loop this card back anyways from outside the game. So yeah, that is something to be wary of, and that is my Shardsworn analysis. Thank you for watching. I will catch you next time.